Disclaimer: no parts of this video should be taken as a medical advice. If you struggle with anxiety or any other disorder or issue, please make informed decisions by researching first and then seeking help. The first time. It was the autumn of 2015, a sunny afternoon at the local park. I visit the place to disconnect and recharge, as being there promotes reflection and daydreaming. Enjoying autumn's colors, such as nature's unique shapes, I was suddenly hit by inexplicable fear. Escalating and all-consuming, that wasn't like anything I previously experienced. My health felt jeopardized in the blink of an eye, and a horrible danger appeared approaching. I had no doubts I was fainting or having a heart attack. Falling apart. Time stretched and I felt like falling apart, somewhat removed from transport. Shaken by jitters, I could barely pull my phone out, only to see its battery dying. Luckily, it lasted enough to call my mother, asking her to request an ambulance while sharing my location. Somehow understanding the situation, Mom made up an explication, saying my condition was due to some pest spraying they had done earlier. While none of that had actually happened, I took the word seriously, and surprisingly, that made things tolerable. Finally, I rode the cab home like nothing happened, yet the autumn proceeded with a few similar episodes. 2016. At the peak of my self-help junkie phase, I searched for ways to increase productivity pretty much by all means. Pressured by hustle culture, I already had elevated anxiety, which I basically ignored. Pushing myself further, I felt shame for not meeting some guru's criteria. Eventually, I experimented with what is known as the nootropic king modafinil, available under different names, the same as advocated by biohackers like Dave Asprey and his bulletproof diet, which also offers some good information actually. Though it was considered primarily safe, new studies showed modafinil's long-term effects are actually questionable. Now, whether my limited experiments with it are related to what happened next can be debatable, as I don't have concrete evidence. On the contrary, my usage preceded a few years of debilitating/crippling panic attacks. Panic attacks. They say a black hole is singularity gone mad. I say a panic attack is anxiety which did the same. A physical fear so intense it shakes the core of your being. In the teachings of Don Juan, Carlos Castaneda defines fear as a treacherous enemy reappearing and changing its face, and this resonates with how my panic attacks changed or perhaps evolved. The face of fear. Initially, it was the fear of fainting, falling apart and getting a seizure, which I never did by the way. Then the shortness of breath, the perceived breathing difficulties coupled with feeling my lungs stuck, unable to contract. The mostly permanent pseudodysphagia, or the fear of choking resulting from sometimes hours-lasting chest and throat tension that was very intense. And then the actual phagophobia, the fear of swallowing due to feeling my throat shrunk and even saliva could be too much. Food textures. I avoided many food textures to prevent potential complications. For similar reasons, I often spat my saliva. Previously, these were classified as separate conditions. Now, an increasing number of researchers view them as different forms of panic disorders, all rooted in anxiety, especially when they are coupled with an unbearable fear. Considering its rapid escalation, the last felt like my body was injected with it, so I sought to escape it. Escaping my body. Usually, my panic attacks lasted between a half and 2 hours. Occasionally, they prolonged for up to 6, imposing limitations that drastically altered my life. From the fear of leaving the block and ultimately my home, agoraphobia, now considered an advanced panic disorder, to rushing out of gyms and supermarkets, leaving weights and grocery carts. Conditioned reflex. Forming thought patterns and Pavlov's conditioned reflex. After 2016, I had negative connotations with all my favorite places, thus I avoided them. While that included the mentioned park, it reached a point where going anywhere other than training and grocery shopping was no longer possible. Dating. My dating took a toll. Apparently, not much happens when you cannot leave the block, and that worsened things as having sex and connecting with a partner makes us humans and relieves anxiety. Revolving my day around my panic attacks, I went through the exact safe ways when moving from one secure place to another, or doing anything, especially showering or going to the toilet. Apparently, no one wants to have a seizure or get choked when doing either of these. A permanent danger. Feeling permanently jeopardized, I was letting others know my exact location because, who knows, that might have been exactly when something in my throat or lung snapped and I needed an ambulance. At some point, I also felt the need to carry two phones, a cruel punishment for a hardcore introvert, which makes you feel like a prisoner or as if crippled, living with a disadvantage. All-consuming fear. Panic attacks consumed much of my vitality. Unlike standard anxiety, they always preceded increased sleepiness and yawning. A predictor of relief, the second indicated that the panic attack ended, but also drained a massive amount of energy. It was a deeply craved moment of calmness, but also one of defeat, as the panic attack basically consumes you. The moment of defeat. Like many, I initially refused to acknowledge the issue. Eventually, things hit the fan, forcing me to start researching. It was similar to realizing your alcohol and or drug addictions jeopardize your future. And it happened after an episode in the late 2018. It was a 6-hour-long panic attack on top of a coat with a sore throat. Covered with several blankets, yet having cold limbs, in those 6 hours I felt my throat shrinking and its walls touching. Now, whether that was only in my head, it kept me from swallowing my saliva and also forced me to start seeking answers. Seeking answers. As a self-help junkie and a biohacker, I first turned to personal development and science. Panic attacks are our body's fight-or-flight response, which developed as part of our survival mechanism, basically being hijacked. Evolving from hunter-gatherers, in the past our species faced life-threatening dangers regularly. While that's no longer the case, the fight or flight still plays a role, and that includes situations when a car, or perhaps a bear approaches us fast, or when there's a potential threat like in a fight. The chemicals the fight or flight releases aren't to hurt, but to prevent getting hurt, to help us go through the situation by fighting or removing ourselves. Besides noradrenaline, that includes a hefty dose of melatonin's antagonist cortisol, the fear hormone. There's no issue with that. The problem comes when the fight or flight gets triggered without real reason regularly. Often, this is explained by burnout, various PTSD, and childhood traumas. The first is the consequence of staying in survival mode for too long, the latter to cause personality deficits, poor stress tolerance, and others beyond the scope of this video. Conventional wisdom. Conventionally, panic attacks treatment includes drugs and cognitive behavior therapy, such as combinations of both. This reminds me of most advice I got back then. It was to take medications like SSRIs, which I refused, as based on my research, doing so leads to dependency, making things far worse. Are panic attacks contagious? Some are afraid panic attacks are contagious. For those like them, panic attacks are not contagious or even slightly dangerous. They're the person's own protection gone berserk. Nothing more, nothing less. Doctors. For the time being, I went to several doctors, usually pulmonologists. The visitations began with feeling like choking, and they ended with the doctor telling me I had about 100 blood saturation due to my active lifestyle. I bought a top-tier BP monitor and spent an obscene amount on lancets and strips to measure blood glucose about 30 times daily, making my pinky look like a pincushion. Thankfully these were great, as I already controlled insulin through fasting and diet. Holistic approaches. Eternally grateful for the impact OMAD, NoFap, and ancestral eating had on my life quality, I decided to approach things similarly. Holistically, the most recommended tactics for combating anxiety include reducing stress, staying hydrated, daily exercise, fasting, and eliminating carbs while eating high-fat and protein diet to keep stable blood glucose. And the reason is that panic attacks are often a byproduct of blood sugar dysregulations. Other tools are optimizing sleep, NoFap, and relaxation techniques like gratitude, journaling, mindfulness, and meditation. Regular sex helps as it stimulates oxytocin and serotonin, whereas porn damages the brain similarly to coke, speed, and others. While life-changing, I was already doing most of those. I also practice mindfulness, gratitude, and journaling thanks to authors like Neville Goddard and Napoleon Hill. Yet, nothing seemed to work for this particular issue. The face of death. A According to mainstream self-help, I had to toughen up, man up, hustle hard, grind harder, and of course, be more disciplined. Sometimes such suggestions were coupled with memento mori. Now, unlike others expecting it to happen sometime in the distant future, people with panic attacks face that regularly. Some suffer a very unpleasant one a few times a day. Struggling alone, they count the seconds to the mentioned deep yawn, assuring they'll be fine for the next few hours or even day if they get lucky. Panic attacks versus depression. Based on 34 years of living, depression and panic attacks are nothing alike, though usually both are caused by chemical imbalances. With the first, discipline and quote-unquote toughening up through willpower can have a chance if you have solid routines. When a real panic attack, and I mean a real panic attack hits, things drastically change. And if they don't, that's not a real panic attack. The experience is extremely intense and even more so physical. Depending on its severity, the anxiety can entirely shut down the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for logic, reasoning, intellect, and self-control. Then, the brain's more primal parts, sometimes called the ancient brain, take control. So there's not much willpower / self-control to exert. Not giving up. Despite feeling defeated, I refused to give up. Deep within, I knew there had to be something beyond the toxic positivity and mindless discipline fanboying, mostly lacking research on behavior and self-control. Around that time, I also became fascinated with the concept of total self-improvement, thanks to people like Joe Dispenza and Aubrey Marcus. It appeared I neglected an aspect of it I always actually questioned: spirituality. Shamans and plant medicine. Researching more, I learned about people healing traumas and going through catharsis with the help of shamans, retreats, and plant medicine. On the contrary, doing ayahuasca and going on long retreats did not feel appropriate, at least not for my materialistic Virgo mind, let alone that it was unavailable as no shamans or deserts are nearby. The element of luck. Once when cleaning old stuff, I found a bunch of books. One was translated version of the teachings of Don Juan, a present I got as a gift with my mom's wishes to create my own reality. Others included her French Commasonry encyclopedia, a pair of white gloves and an apron, such as the unfortunate psychic self-defense and cosmic doctrine. I remember them being stored with others and a couple of tarot decks I played with as a child, and all this felt familiar, natural, and inviting. Pure curiosity. Driven by curiosity, I looked for English copies of those and similar titles. What grabbed my attention was an author appearing while I researched for the unfortunate Neville Goddard or even Dale Carnegie. That author was Israel Regardie, particularly his Middle Pillar and Art of True Healing. Initially, I paid no attention. Ultimately, I read an incomplete copy of the original Middle Pillar. Doubting I understood everything, I got very intrigued by two claims. 1. Paraphrasing, the gods and demons of the past became the archetypes and phobias of the future / present. And 2. So-called neuroses, including panic disorders, result from tension and poor communication between the Ruach or conscious mind ego and the Nefesh or animal soul. While this was eye-opening, the even better was that breaking that tension was one of the Middle Pillar's utilities. It lets free energy flow, engaging the hard aspects of the self. Science. Regarding finding common grounds between Kabbalah and science really fascinated me. This included describing Kabbalists and magicians as empirical scientists, also distinguishing Magick with a K from superstitions and hexes. That made trusting him natural. It also made me consider a master's in psychology, which I took the same years. Though the program didn't care much about Jung or Assagioli, it inspired me to research the newest discoveries on behavior and self-control, which later proved invaluable. Considering the one-year manual, Christopher Hyatt, and his friendship with Robert Anton Wilson, Regardie also didn't ignore those. The Tree of Life. Regardie's books introduced me to the Tree of Life, which, though highly complex, felt extremely intriguing. I learned about the 4 parts of the soul, and that was also game-changing. Elsewhere, I found phobias and anxiety being regarded as a byproduct of the ego, punishing or forcing the nefesh too much. This made sense considering my experience with hustle culture. It also resonated with many of the recently discovered consequences of exerting too much self-control and or trying to assimilate too much information too rapidly. The limitations of the Ruach. Improvements are only possible when the nefesh's powers, i.e. psychosexual energy, are appropriately channeled. And thanks to the own fortune, I also learned that the Ruach cannot pick goals organized and plan haphazardly. The reason is that Hot's intellect and reasoning are only possible due to Netzach's emotions, passions and desires being the basis for the nefesh's instincts. As mentioned in other videos, this provides a deeper understanding of the rational and emotional brain dynamic. According to Stanford Baba Schiff and the late Christopher Hart, the reasoning brain only rationalizes the decisions the emotional has already made. The Middle Pure. Soon after reading the complete Middle Pure, I stood still and breathed rhythmically for 20 to 30 minutes every morning. I also followed the Kabbalistic cross with the basic Middle Pure thrice daily. While meditation didn't do much previously, things were different then. Still excruciating, my anxiety was more manageable. The difference allowed me to visit more places, not to rush out of the gym, nor let others know my location. Not necessarily, at least. Happy with that, I made the mentioned non-negotiable daily practice as important as the gym. Change. Changing my performance expectations, I also developed an instinct to ensure my nefesh was satisfied and got what it wanted. Yet the improvements were only partial, as I still had around 1 panic attack daily with about 2 severe ones weekly. Palm reading. Somewhat unable to date, I dated a lady who was into Agni Yoga and occasionally visited Bali for shamanic group workings. For some reason, she had a distaste for Western magic and very bad connotations with Crowley. One day, this lady insisted on giving me a palm reading. In doing so, she said there was a great darkness in my past and I spread myself too thin. Though I hated it, my fear moved me toward the light / the truth / the right direction by pulling myself together and reminding me time was limited. Not in general, but here and now. This resonated with the shared reflections on Memento Mori and instinctively devoting much of my anxiety-free time to writing Omad gains, building my writing habit as if my life depended on it. SIRP. Working to different books, I learned a technique called the Supreme Pentagram Ritual. Appreciating its invigorating effects and how responsible it was making me, I made the right part of my daily practice. Something I didn't realize is that to a great extent, SRP can make hardwired notions and conditioning become questionable / optional, especially when using the associated with preformative states fire and water, which is also supported by followers. It eases you, to say the least, into digging deep and doing so-called internal work through difficult to ignore trains of thought. This way, you can re-examine episodes from your past and present, extract meaning, and develop nuance if necessary. As mentioned elsewhere, the right predisposes to what Christopher Hart called undoing yourself. Contemplating the Fear. Once when I got out of a slightly distant grocery store, I experienced a severe panic attack as bad as those during 2016. Following the conditioned reflex, I was about to go through my precautions routine, speeding up my walk, prepping my phone, focusing on bodily sensations, etc. Rather than engaging in those, however, I noticed an unusual desire to stay and see what would have happened. It was almost as if an inner voice told me I could go, but that was optional. Why don't you stay and see if you actually choke, pass out, or whatever? What if this whole panic disorder is optional? Zooming out. After a moment, I was no longer focused on the panic attack. There was no tunnel vision, but an internal monologue and self-contemplation. This shifted my attention from the fear to whether my response was appropriate, and then to the surroundings. It transitioned from a narrow and zoomed in to a wider one like a zoom lens. Moving fast, this train of thought made me conclude that my quote-unquote secure measurements weren't really helping. They were reinforcing the conditioned reflex and thus the panic attacks. Getting out of the tunnel. The episode showed me that escaping the tunnel is not by focusing on it, but by shifting your attention to anything and everything else. As Tony Robbins says, energy goes where attention flows. Once attention shifts, the panic attack drops from 9 or 10 to 5 or 6. Tolerable enough, this lets us focus further on other things. The more that happens, the more you're out. The issue isn't necessarily fear per se. Often, it is the conditioned reflex one initially develops when not knowing what to expect. A hole in the wall. They say magic brings apocalypse, which means rending the veil. It shows the truth for what it is. The depicted moment of truth did not cure my panic attacks. It felt like making a hole in a prison cell wall. Letting white in, that made the law of attraction work like it was on steroids. Soon, I became aware of numerous researchers regarding shifting attention as superior for combating anxiety and panic attacks. Some even claim that the breathing and meditation techniques actually aim at that. Switching the channel. As if by magic, I stumbled upon Joseph Ledoux's Anxious. Dealing with anxiety disorders, the book gives tons of practical advice. Yet, it felt like something wanted me to read it, just for one concept, surprisingly included in its Blinkist version. Namely, our brains are like TV receivers. Anxiety is only one of the channels we can watch. The shared experiences put the remote control in my hands. From then on, nothing was the same. It was a synchronicity similar to Rick Rubin accidentally opening a book on a page only to read a life-saving sentence. I still had panic attacks, yet I could manage them by shifting my attention. They no longer felt like a prison, but more like losing ground here and there. No need for vacuum. At some point, I found excess banishing create a vacuum. As Mark Stavish reminds us, nature hates that, feeling it however it finds suitable. I thought SIRP 4 elements counteracted that, keeping me balanced. On the contrary, paying more attention to my results totality showed my introversion deteriorated, which means it got awful. As mentioned elsewhere, there was apathy, and my goals and aspirations felt unusually distant. A fresh start. Having such reflections, once when meditating after SIRP, this time with a charge of intent and rending the veil, as the rite works with the veil of Paroquet, my mind landed on the conclusion to actually start from scratch. Solely on intuition, I assumed invoking often and inflaming myself might help burn my anxiety, whereas too much banishing gives it room to manifest. I also reflected on all holistic approaches bringing value to my life, as opposed to conventional wisdom, and then wondered why magic had to be different. Alternative ways. Searching for alternative ways, thanks to Scott Stanwyck, I learned about the operant model, which I discuss extensively. Soon, I swapped all my banishings for their invoking counterparts. I also began emphasizing the 3 pillars rite over the middle pillar. It took a week and I began experimenting with planetary forces, something I wanted but had been putting off for the last 6 months of banishing. Wonder why. Meanwhile, extensive usage of SIRP fire coincided with a desire to quit coffee, an unthinkable notion considering I had abused it since 3rd grade. Quitting coffee. The law of attraction worked again, leading me to studies on caffeine elevating cortisol. Now, the body elevates cortisol at around 4 am as a part of a counter-regulatory hormone response. There's no issue with that. The problem occurs when attempting to sustain waking up at 3 or 4 am with coffee, as some gurus recommend. This sets oneself up for too much cortisol, increasing chances of a panic attack at around 7 or 8 am, though this wasn't the only time when I had mine. I stumbled on independent researchers exposing companies selling coffee with caffeine 10 times the norm, and after quitting coffee earlier, a gym buddy slept for 2 days. I did that and experienced nothing, pushing to daily SIRP fire, really engaging my courage. I just became somewhat unhealthily aware of exactly how much resentment and anger I had toward a former family member. Ultimately, quitting caffeine improved things, yet it didn't eradicate my anxiety. A solid platform. Emphasizing invocations proved to keep my psyche grounded, like a solid ground under my feet. It's like a reliable platform on which I walk and make changes. There's no vacuum, only a base for accomplishing something. Once you realize you won't choke or die or whatever, overcoming a panic attack can happen purely through common sense, which excess banishing may also banish. Let me know if that resonates. Fighting disbalances. Achieving balance is one of Magick's goals. The tactics, however, depend on your psychological makeup. Reflecting on sephirotic polarities and personality deficits, I recognized unproductive Geburan forces dominating my childhood and teenage years. This proceeded with an obsession to control my life through sheer willpower, a misunderstood Gebura, aka Pachat, aka Fear, and a bad joke with a very high price. Expansion. Using Paracelsus' Golden Dawn attribution, I began working with Jupiterian spirits. Rather than limiting the workings to Thursday, I used GRH, the planet's positioning, and the actual hours. I started visiting my favorite places in about 2 weeks, and that felt like Jove's expansion expanded my options/areas to visit. The reflection of Hesed. Focusing on Jupiter resulted in an instinctual need to explore hot Mercury. Initially, I thought something wanted to balance itself as hot is Gebura on a lower arc, or that this had something to do with me being a Virgo. On the other hand, Hesed emanates hot, which is its reflection, so I started alternating those planets. Besides helping me write my second book about discipline built through systems and organizations ruled by hot, such a regimen boosted my reasoning and common sense. It also got me into coding as a side hobby, which is pure intellect. Eventually, reasoning myself out of a panic attack became readily doable, so I devised new thought routines and patterns for different scenarios. Reasoning and communication. One night while online dating, I encountered a new UX/UI designer open to discussing coding. At that moment, something made me recall Don Webb's prescription for magicians to have a long and meaningful relationship to help them understand themselves and the universe better. Now, whether she fits the criteria can be debatable, as she doesn't want to do anything with magic besides supporting it as part of who I am. Yet, her being around inspired me to massively step up my game regarding my practice, personal development, and life. 2 years later, I have no doubts that she meets the criteria. And whether that has anything to do with it, Hesed Jupiter is the vision of love and the element of work. Occasional anxiety. These days, I might get anxious or panicky occasionally, but that doesn't escalate how it used to. If I overdo my invocations, I can also get some racing and somewhat disturbing thoughts, which I know how to shut down readily. Otherwise, Gebura is my go-to for difficult decisions, and I take less than 300 mg of caffeine in the form of quality dark chocolate after lots of green and Earl Grey tea throughout the day. Surprisingly, I am also the most productive and inspired I've been, enjoying sustained performance and the ability to get my ideas out faster than ever. So I feel liberated, knowing resources like time and willpower are limited. It's up to me to make the most out of them by keeping my ego and nefesh in permanent collaboration, each getting its own. Meaning and philosophy. In Book 4, Crowley regards philosophy as magic's enemy. In my humble opinion, that is only true if one attempts to put it before ritual, scientific research, and actual life experiences. Following those, philosophy extracts meaning. Elements. Elemental magic allows making the most out of the past by giving it a different meaning. Also, to see some truths for what they are. This often implies an apocalypse, which can hurt as structures and dogmas collapse before one heals and basically recollects themselves. Both implying some retrospection, elemental magic can go hand in hand with different forms of psychoanalysis. Leviathan. Reflecting on that, I often view panic attacks and their roots in childhood traumas as loosely mapping to the fall myth, particularly to its part with Leviathan. The newborn is close to the divine. Everything is possible. Then Leviathan happens in the face of parenting, schooling, and conditioning. Later, when the person attempts to transcend those and reach their potential, Leviathan starts causing trouble from within, and this results in anxiety, phobias, depression, and anything keeping one stuck. Kundabuffer. Panic attacks can also be examined alongside Gurdjieff's Kundabuffer and superhuman efforts. According into A Search of Being and In the Search of the Miraculous, true self-actualization is an act against God and nature. In my humble opinion, this is mostly the dominating egregor and one's conditioning. Usually faced by close to unbearable resistance, true self-actualization is only possible through superhuman effort. Much of that resistance comes from what Beelzebub defines as Kundabuffer. Whether an actual organ, the water resembles in many ways Leviathan, keeping one relapsing / falling to their programming. Planets and science. Planetary and zodiac magic lets one reinvent themselves, aligning with who they want to be. They go hand in hand with Murita and logotherapies, building the appropriate identity / personality traits, while opening ways to a desired future. And usually, this has to do with utilizing the pillars of function. Whether you agree, this wraps up how I got into magic 6+ years ago. It was to increase my chances of solving a problem, sucking the life out of me. 6 years later, I mostly use it for the same. Yet, thanks to doing so, I have much better problems. But that's just my opinion. Let me know your thoughts and if my story resonates. Thank you for your time.